What role does Albert Jay Nock's essay, Isaiah's Job, play in the libertarian movement today? Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's Libertarian Angle as we examine that question. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you all the principled, uncompromising case for entire libertarian philosophy. I'm joined, as I am every week, or most weeks, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, professor of economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
It's good to see you, and good to see that you seem to be almost lifelike and alive and well.
Yeah, Richard's referring to the fact that I am a COVID survivor, got this thing, and man, it hit me hard for the last 10 days or so, which is why you haven't seen, or part of the reason you haven't seen my blog on a regular basis, but I'm on the road to recovery now, and it's good to be back with you all. Richard, you've written an interesting article for a future issue of Future of Freedom. I ended up proofing that, and I thought, well, why don't we discuss that in advance, not in great detail, but the basic concept. You brought up the idea or this work that influenced both of us many, many years ago when we discovered libertarianism, and that's Isaiah's Job. It's an essay that's written by a man named Albert Jay Nock, and it had a tremendous influence on both of us. When you go back to those days when you and I were first discovering libertarianism, and we both attended seminars over at the Foundation for Economic Education, and we were having speaker programs in Dallas where we were both living. I mean, things were really bad, and they had been even worse in terms of liberty, but they had been even worse in the 1950s and the 1960s when people were really holding real lonely ground back then. And so Nock writes this essay called Isaiah's Job, which is drawn on the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, who was charged by God to go out and deliver the message about what the people were doing, the truth about society. And Isaiah starts complaining to God and says, look, I'm giving them the truth. They don't want to hear the truth. They don't want to know the truth. They're rejecting what I have to say. They're ridiculing me. They're ignoring me. I'm just wasting my time. And God's response to Isaiah was, no, you continue speaking the truth, regardless of the reaction that you're getting among people, because there's a remnant out there. There's a group of people that are receptive to the truth. You don't know who they are, but God knows who they are. And they need to hear this. They need to be refortified in their beliefs. And by listening to what you're saying, it strengthens their conviction. And I can relate to that, Richard. I mean, whenever I see somebody exposing the truth about the welfare warfare state under which we're living, it makes me feel good. I mean, it's like, okay, I'm not the only one out here that is speaking the truth. But clearly, we're living in a very dysfunctional society, one where people do reject what we have to say. I just wrote in a blog this week of how weird this society is that we're living in. I mean, it's a totally weird society. You got mass gun killings taking place. You've got this drug war that's gone on for ages that they continue enforcing. You've got this culture of death and foreign policy, foreign intervention, foreign wars. You got a massive national security state, massive welfare state, mandatory charity. Whatever happened to the war on poverty? I mean, that turned out to be a big joke. I mean, we're living in a totally dysfunctional society, and yet everybody sits there and says, oh, thank God I'm an American, because at least I know I'm free. And so what we're really doing, as far as I'm concerned, Richard, we're doing what Nock talked about in Isaiah's Job. We're over there speaking the truth, even if American statists don't want to hear it. Because we also know that there's a lot of people that do want to hear the truth about what's going on. And so why don't I turn it over to you and give us a little background of who Albert Jay Nock was, why people should even read him today. It's a great book, Our Enemy, the State. It's fantastic. So give us a little synopsis of who Albert Jay Nock was, and what motivated you to talk about him in your article for our journal, Future of Freedom?
Yeah, Albert Jay Nock was probably one of the best writers and insightful journalist authors on classical liberal libertarian ideas and principles in certainly the first half of the 20th century. He was born in Scranton, Pennsylvania in 1870. He died in Rhode Island in August of 1945. He had gone to college at what is now known as Bard College. He followed in his father's footsteps and became an ordained minister around 1900. He also, around that same time, got married. But in 1909, he left the ministry and abandoned his wife and two sons when they were little kids. Nobody knows the story about this. As every biographer or person who knew him says, Nock was an unbelievably private person. Piecing his life together the way a biographer would want to in the traditional sense is extremely difficult. But it doesn't seem to be an acrimonious parting with his wife, because he kept on very good relationships in supporting his children. And in fact, one of his sons, Francis Nock, later edited a collection of his letters after he had passed away in 1955. But what he decided to do was to follow a career of journalism. And he did so, writing for some of the prominent publications of the day, including The Nation, when The Nation magazine was not the left publication we think of it as today, but was still fairly classical liberal in much of its orientation. He started writing. He wrote a book shortly after the First World War on the myth of the guilty nation. In other words, the idea it's not as if Germany was the only bad guy who caused World War I. Each country was after its own political nationalistic goals, and it was a configuration of many forces that brought about the disaster of the First World War. He wrote a very well-received biography of Thomas Jefferson. He wrote a book on the failures of American education, in which he basically lambasted the idea of state schooling of any sort, from grammar school certainly through college, and called for an enlightened privatization of education. A book also that was very well received because of the quality of its writing and its insightfulness of argument, even if most people were not ready to accept that at the time. But then, fast forwarding to the 1930s, he became increasingly focused on politics. He'd always been writing on these political issues, but he became increasingly focused on politics with first the coming of Herbert Hoover as president in 1929, and then the Depression, and most forcefully with Franklin Roosevelt's presidency beginning in 1933. In Nock's mind, Roosevelt was the epitome of everything that could go wrong in America: a rejection of individual liberty, a rejection of constitutional limited government, a rejection of a respect for private property and the free market economy. The result is that from around 1934-35, he started writing a monthly column for the American Mercury, which was an extremely widely read publication that had originally been founded and long time edited by H.L. Mencken. And these are insightful essays, Jacob, on the psychology, the politics, the economic disasters, the arrogance and hubris of Franklin Roosevelt, the spineless opportunism of the Republicans. But out of this, in 1935, he publishes a book called Our Enemy, the State, which you mentioned. He'd been greatly influenced by the German sociologist Franz Oppenheimer. And building on Oppenheimer, he said, there are two forces in society. There's social power and political power. Social power is the free actions of free people in a free society, and the cumulative positive outcomes of culture, literature, material betterment through the interactions of people pursuing their own goals and finding mutual opportunities for agreed upon association and exchange. And then there's political power. Political power is when government intrudes, suppresses, regulates, controls, or attempts to abolish the free actions of people in this social power. And it distorts, it tyrannizes, it corrupts, it hinders, it arrests culture and progress. And he said that is the battle America was going through. That would people be free in America and pursue the freedom of social power, that is the free interactions of free men, or will it be dominated by political power, the government's coercive ability to command, control, restrict, plan, prohibit, and threaten? He said that, of course, this was nothing new in American history. He has a chapter in which he relates the fact that since the early founding of the country, there had always been corrupt politicians and people wanting favors and privileges from the state. It was a lot less, and it was more narrowly focused back in the 1900s, perhaps, but it was nonetheless there. And if I can just mention as sort of like an annotated footnote, maybe some viewers and listeners might be familiar with a book by Jonathan Hughes called The Governmental Habit. He was an economic historian. The book came out in the 1970s, and he, as an economic historian, traces the interconnections between government and local government and state and special interest groups getting favors, privileges, subsidies, monopoly protections in early American history. So it wasn't as if Nock was pulling this out of his hat. It is an historical case. But in the 20th century, this explodes with not just the corruptions and intrusions of state and local government, but now the federal government dominates the society increasingly with Franklin Roosevelt. And the other point that in line with this, again, around 1934, he did an article for the American Mercury called Progress Towards Collectivism. And he says in this essay that he was in a conversation with a friend. And the friend says, the government is so big. If we could only get rid of these New Deal policies, business would be unfettered. The enterpriser would be happy to be on his own. And Nock says no. Now, Nock was willing to criticize special interest groups among labor unions and leftist ideology groups, but he said that, businessmen want to eat at the trough of the state as much as the other groups. There's always this. So he basically was saying that there was always underlining in America variations on the theme of crony capitalism, the corrupt businessman who wants favors, privileges, monopoly protections against his competitors at the expense of consumers. So he said, no, if that such a policy was to be introduced, businessmen would go berserk. What? I don't get my subsidy. I don't get my trade protection. I don't get my special government contract. So he was very focused on these things. With the upshot of it being is that in 1936, as the election is coming up for what became Franklin Roosevelt's second term in the White House, he did this article on Isaiah's job. And he said these are gloomy times, but they're no gloomier than Isaiah faced, as you were saying. Men were sinking into sin and corrupt behavior. God sends Isaiah out to preach the word of salvation and righteousness, and Isaiah is despondent. People are continuing to do all of these sinful things, and he says, God, why have you sent me on this impossible mission? And as you were saying, Jacob, God says, in Nock's paraphrasing of the Bible story, it's not your job to be wondering who hears and how it affects people. That's my job, because I can look into people's hearts and souls, because I'm God. Your job is to basically preach what you know to be true: righteousness, honor, principle, and so on. And let me worry about who's hearing and who responds, even if you never see the fruits of your labors. And Nock seeing the growth of collectivism in the 1930s, and of course then into the 1940s, as I said, he died in 1945, was increasingly despondent. So he said, while it seems that all the currents are in the wrong direction, we have a duty as people who have discovered and believe in and care about the ideal of liberty, personal liberty, economic liberty, social liberty. Our duty, who understand these ideas, is to act as a remnant, to preserve, maintain, cultivate, foster, help spread these ideas. It won't be easy. The forces against us are strong, and we don't know where the people are who want to hear our message, but they're out there. Even if we never find out who's read an article, who's overheard a conversation, who did we influence in some exchange of ideas, even if at the time they seem that we've just been beating our head against the wall. Now, in my article, a future article of mine, which should be, I guess, it's the August issue of Future of Freedom, Jacob, I tell a personal story, and I'd like to relate it if I may, because it reinforced Nock's conception of this in my mind. Many decades ago, I was in graduate school in the New York area, and to make some extra money, I was teaching part-time over at the newer campus of Rutgers University in New Jersey, night classes. So one night I leave the university after the class. I take the subway under the Hudson River to Lower Manhattan, where I normally would then get on the New York subway system to go home in Queens, where I was living. But I often would get off, since I was between train connections, to do some shopping at a little supermarket in Lower Manhattan. I'm waiting online there one evening, and at the checkout counter, and I sense that this woman behind me on the line is like staring at me, and I look at her, and she says, finally she looks at me and says, "Aren't you Richard Ebeling? You teach at Rutgers, don't you?" "Yes." "You have ruined my marriage." Help? Help, I'm looking for the exit. And then she repeats it loud. "You've ruined my marriage." Of course, now everybody's looking over. I said, "Excuse me?" And she says, "My husband took your economics class last semester. And do you know what he's done to him? He comes home from work, turns on the evening news, watches it, and then spends the rest of the evening complaining about government. You have ruined my marriage." This is an absolutely true story. Now, how did she know who I was? Other than I have presumed maybe she was on campus with her husband, and the husband pointed me out, walking around the campus grounds. I have no idea. And who was her husband? I don't know who he was. Was he an A student? Was he a C student? Did he sit in the front? Did he sit in the back? Did he ask questions? Was he silent the whole semester? I have no idea who he was. But it was clear that even though I was starting out my own teaching and learning how to lecture in the classroom, some things I said touched him, influenced him, made him think about these things. And I never knew this. That's Isaiah's job. If I had not had that bizarre interaction with this guy's wife, I would have never known I had had that influence on him. So that is saying that we can never be certain who and how many people, what we have to say in a reasoned, articulate, intelligent, and as best as we can ourselves, informed way, can have an impact on others. And that then works on others and others and others. And even if the situation, the circumstances seem so gloomy and despondent today, the idea of liberty touches a chord with many people. They just don't even know it. It's like the entrepreneur who offers a new product that consumers have not been familiar with. They didn't even know he was producing it and about to present it on the market. But when it's given to them, they then realize, yeah, that's something that's useful. Yeah, I want one of those. Well, that's how the ideas of freedom, intellectual entrepreneurs for liberty, if you will, that we can serve as in spreading these ideas slowly but surely and impacting people in ways and in directions and over periods of time that we cannot know. So we have to look beyond the politics of the time. And in this article that will be out in the August issue, I enumerate in the early part of the article the trends towards the growth of government, the welfare state, the warfare state, the growth of military spending and intrusions, the non-monetary aspects of this, beyond government taxing and expenditure, the influences and intrusions and surveillancings on our life in the name of a war on terrorism, a war on drugs, an attempt to control a border, the idea of having to know what we're doing and pandemic control of how we interact with others, that can make us very gloomy. Just as it must have seemed gloomy to Albert Jay Nock in the 1930s, alone with few others fighting this trend towards New Deal collectivism and all the other collectivisms that he could see around the world. And he traveled in Europe and witnessed these things there as well. But his voice and others like him at that time helped the ideas to stay alive and to foster and cultivate a new generation of classical liberals and libertarians who then themselves influence another generation. That's our task today, to do the Knockian job, even if it seems that the trends are all in the wrong direction, because trends change, a theme that was often taken up by Ludwig von Mises, the economist. But trends can change, and the trends can change for us as well as against us. And if we're to have that impact, we cannot fall such into a state of depression and despair that we just throw up our hands. Liberty can succeed if we're willing to do our Isaiah's job.
Yeah, that's an excellent synopsis of Nock and his works. In fact, Richard, I think that if I were talking to young libertarians today, people who had just discovered libertarianism, I would recommend Isaiah's job to them as one of the premier writings, because everybody's faced with a choice when you discover libertarianism. That choice is, should I go into this movement as a reformer, as an advocate of reform, or should I go into it as an advocate of liberty? Now, the reason I say that reform isn't liberty is because when you've got a system that has destroyed freedom, if all you do is reform it, you haven't achieved freedom because you're leaving this system intact. Now, you may be trying to fix it, make it better, make it more efficient, but the fact is you're leaving it intact. And unfortunately, I think that phenomenon describes the predominant sentiment in the libertarian movement. It orients toward reform. Those of us that say, no, let's stick only with liberty. Let's make the case for dismantling the educational system. Let's not make the case for trying to improve it with school vouchers, or let's get rid of Medicare and Social Security instead of health savings accounts and Social Security privatization. And in other words, we're making the case for a genuinely free society, which is much more difficult to make. But I would argue that anybody that wants genuine liberty, a free society, has got to take that lonely ground, the Knockian ground, even if everybody around you is saying, oh, no, that's just way too radical. Now, let me share with you my own personal example. And I know longtime supporters of FFF know that this is how I discovered libertarianism. I'm in my late 20s. I go into the public library in my hometown of Laredo, Texas. I was a young lawyer. I figured that I was going to practice law the rest of my life. I mean, I loved practicing law. I was a trial attorney. And I look in the public library for something to read, and I go into the political science section, and I find these 4 little different colored books called Essays on Liberty. And I pull them out, and I start perusing them, and it was a road to Damascus experience. I mean, it was just shocking. I could feel all of the indoctrination, the thick layers of indoctrination just shattering. Because these were hardcore purist libertarian essays, no reform oriented at all. In fact, if those essays had been things like calling for school vouchers and health savings accounts and regulatory reform and so forth, I don't think I would have become a libertarian. The fact is that these were pure Knockian Isaiah's job type of essays. Well, these books had been written published back in the 1950s by the Foundation for Economic Education under the auspices of its president, Leonard Read. If somebody had asked Read in the 50s, when these books were published, what impact the books have had, he obviously could not have said, well, 20 years from now, they're going to influence the life and change the course of a life of a young lawyer in a town called Laredo, Texas. But instead, what Read was doing, what Fee was doing in those early days was the Knockian job. They were just publishing the truth, even though the wide sentiment across America was in favor of the welfare state, the warfare state. Read stuck by his guns and published these little books along with a lot of other essays on hardcore libertarianism.
Right.
And that had an effect on me, and it changed the course of my life. In fact, I later wrote an essay called Leonard Read Changed My Life that was published by the Freeman, which was Fee's magazine at the time. So that's the thing that we've got to keep in mind, is that not only are we doing Isaiah's job in terms of fortifying the remnant, you never know the impact you're going to have in terms of influencing the course of somebody's life 10, 20, 30 years from now.
I think that we have to, in reinforcing this, is that you never know. Okay, let me bring out another point. One of Nock's greatest admirers was another well-known libertarian author of the 1940s and 1950s, and that was Frank Chodorov. He has an excellent book called The Rise and Fall of Society, which follows in the Knockian analysis. He has a great book called One is a Crowd. That's a real individualist when you're by yourself and you think there are too many. But that's a real individualist. But he wrote an essay, and I think it might even be in that book, in which he says, he asked the question, what is the purpose of teaching individualism, liberty, freedom? He says, it's not to make individualists, but to find them. There's a lot of people who are not going to be interested in this message for one purpose or another. But there are those people out there, as I was saying, like the person who's offered a new product and they suddenly say, now that I know about it, sure, that's what I want. Yeah, that's what I've been looking for. There are people who have never heard these freedom ideas, or not in the way that perhaps could be presented to them in a more principled way. And if they hear those ideas, it clicks with them. And that's the importance of liberty, in arousing enough discovery in oneself by others that the number of us increase. And then they influence others, and they influence others, and they influence others. And that, we cannot lose sight of that. I would just mention for the viewers, is that here is his well-known book, Our Enemy the State. It's in a very inexpensive paperback. You actually can get it for PDF free online. And then a number of years ago, Liberty Fund of Indianapolis put together a collection of his essays, which is called The State of the Union, Essays in Social Criticism, so mostly political, some others are not, more the sort of the social criticisms of the wider situation of the society. This too, I believe, can be gotten as a PDF. And then finally, I would just mention that if you just go to Google and say Albert Jay Nock, Isaiah's Job, you're immediately going to find PDF versions of that essay that you can just download for free. He is one of the most impressive voices. And I'll just mention one other book of his that he published a couple of years before he died, called Memoirs of a Superfluous Man, a man out of step, out of time, going against the tide. And while he talks a bit about himself in there, he highlights again the importance of not being sucked into the idea of following the current cultural and political trends as if you have to. It's not a matter of going along to get along. It's a matter of having an element in yourself where even if you're against the tide, you're true to yourself by following what you know to be the right and the proper, not just in how one acts as a human being in general, but in the political and the social philosophy that continues to remind people of the society of liberty that could be and can be and will be if there's enough of us.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Chodorov's methodology, because I'm convinced that he was right. That I've been doing this at FFF for 32 years now, and I've become convinced over those years that you can't convert people to libertarianism, that they got to convert themselves. And so there are just certain people that are receptive to this philosophy and to the purity of this philosophy. And our job, as Chodorov pointed out, is to find those people. And sometimes you find them indirectly, not by going to the airport and buttonholing everybody and saying, hey, I want you to be a libertarian, but by putting out the ideas and let the ideas find those people the way they found me. And then you brought up another very important point here, is that, a lot of people get despondent, Richard. They get burned out in this movement. They say, oh, gosh, nobody's listening to me. I'm not affecting change. Things are worse today than they've ever been. And so they get burned out. They either turn to reform or they just drop out completely. Well, that doesn't have to be, because it's not your job to save the world. I mean, this is the idea that Nock was pointing out in Isaiah's job, that God is saying, this is my job to save the world, not your job. Your job is just to speak the truth. And I think that once you put that into perspective and you think, okay, that's, as long as I'm doing my job, I can enjoy it. This is a fun movement. I mean, libertarianism is, I think, the most glorious philosophy that's ever been conceived, and to be part of this movement is very exciting and very enjoyable and very fun. So we have to watch carefully that we don't fall victim to this, oh my gosh, the world is going to hell in a handbasket, and oh, let me go take my cyanide capsule. No, that's not your job. Your job is simply to speak the truth, put the ideas into the marketplace, and let them go.
Absolutely.
All right, on that note, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all for tuning in. Remember, I got my new book, An Encounter with Evil, the Abraham Zapruder story. You can get it on Amazon. And Richard referred to our monthly journal, Future of Freedom. Subscribe there at fff.org. Come to our website for, 32 years of principled, uncompromising articles, videos, conferences, lectures, and so forth. And subscribe to our FFF Daily, which we strive to make the best libertarian commentary page on the internet on a daily basis, and of course to this YouTube channel. Richard, as always, I greatly enjoy the conversation. Thanks for the great insights on Albert Jay Nock.
Thank you, and thanks to our viewers and listeners for once again sharing a bit of their time with us.